Greetings to all of our viewers and listeners around the world. This is Christopher Halali. Welcome back to the Chris Halali Show presented by DD Geopolitics. Great to see you. Good morning to those of you in the United States, especially those of you on the East Coast. We know it's early. We see that the numbers are slowly climbing as people slowly get their morning coffees. But welcome to all the viewers from around the world. And I'm really honored and really pleased to introduce not only a guest of the show, but a friend of the show, a comrade of the show, of course. Dr. Tim Anderson is the director of the Sydney-based Center for Counter Hegemonic Studies. He's also a former professor, a lecturer, and really an activist par excellence. He has been on the front lines of so many of the imperialist aggression around the world, reporting from below, reporting for the global majority, for the global South, and really a fighter for the oppressed. And so I want to introduce him and bring him on the show. And it's a pleasure to have you on, Tim. Welcome.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for your kind words, and it's very good to see you again.
It's a pleasure to see you. Now, you just got back from Iran. You were on a press tour. You were with Dimitri Lascaris. I had him on the show, with Ahmed from Propaganda & Co., also with a Turkish journalist who was with you for the first part of the tour as well.
That's right. Adam Metin from Turkey. Yeah.
That's right, from Turkey. So I wanted to sort of to start, provide some sort of your first impressions. You've been to Iran before many times. This wasn't your first trip to Iran. Tell us what you saw now. You arrived about, I think, 3 weeks ago at this point to Iran. So what was there on the ground when you arrived?
So we arrived on the 19th and we stayed till the 31st. We came in overland from the north, and normally I would have flown in through the Persian Gulf, but of course all the Persian Gulf airports are non-functional with the war. So we came in from the north, and we then did a tour down through cities, Tabriz to Tehran, to Isfahan, to Shiraz, to Bushehr, to Bandar Abbas, to Minab in the south, and then back up north again. So we toured a number of the major cities, looking at two things, really, I suppose. One is the impact of the war, which is really, to me, like a systematic collection of terrorist attacks, because there's no front line. This is not a normal sort of war, and a number of Iranian people made that point. It's not like the Iran-Iraq war. It's not like the war in Syria or South Lebanon. You've got some sort of front line. You've got militaries confronting each other in some way. These are attacks from the air, basically. But at the same time, you've got this extraordinary response by Iranian people. They are rallying out in public, remaining out in public. For example, in Tehran, you have about 22 squares, I think. And so we went to one of them. The same in all the other cities. They were out in the evening, big aggregations of people really supporting their country, supporting their military. And otherwise, this extraordinary sort of system of people living their everyday lives, like in Isfahan, in the Shah Abbas Palace, which is a beautiful area. People are going about in beautiful conditions, their lives. And in the background, you see this plume of smoke and an explosion. So there are these attacks going on. It's by no means carpet bombing, because Iran's very big and the cities are very big, but there are regular attacks going on. You hear the explosions. Every city we were in, we heard some explosions, basically. And each of those, of course, and most of them are on civilian areas, basically, but each of them has tragedies and massacres, sometimes one or two people, sometimes a handful of people killed, sometimes a whole family. And then there was a number of schools that have been hit. Of course, the first one was Minab in the south. We went there to the graveyard, to the school and so on, but also children playing sports on fields near Shiraz, and the families of targeted individuals being wiped out, and children in hospital. So we saw a lot of the aftermath of these attacks by the US and the Israelis. And then at the same time, this extraordinary sort of everyday life going on in a way, with people quite unafraid and indeed rallying in support of their country, in support of their military.
That's amazing. I mean, one thing that was so important for your delegation was really to bring the images to a Western audience in the English language, because a lot of that hadn't really been getting through. There weren't a lot of Western journalists on the ground. And there's been really an information blockade, not only now, but for many, many years, about the truth of what's going on in Iran. And you have been on the front line reporting on this and writing books about this war, not only against Iran, but the entire axis of resistance. When you were there, since you've been before, what was the mood on the ground that you talked to people, you could sense it, the atmosphere? What was the mood like of the Iranian people as these bombs were raining down on them?
Well, the extraordinary thing is, as I said, it's a big country. The cities are very big, so the bombs are raining down, but the bombs are here and there, so it's not like it is systematic. It's not like Gaza in that way, that or South Lebanon even, or even Beirut, where the situation, I believe, is much more dangerous, and still to this day. But there are these regular attacks, but there is this extraordinary attitude of the people. They want to be out on the streets. They want to be in public. Even musicians, people are saying, why don't you find some shelter? And they want to be out there. They want to confront this. They want to see it. They want to show other people that they are supporting their country. There are people coming in from other countries, from Europe, from Turkey, from other parts of the world, because even people who are political dissidents in some way or had some problems with their government, but they've come back, they've returned to their country. Unlike refugees fleeing a war in a country, which is more common, people are coming back and they're gathering in these groups there. The Eid prayer we went to in that huge mosque in Tehran was extraordinary. Tens of thousands of people, and then rallies outside the mosques, outside the prayers, so there's an extraordinarily public demonstration of people waving the flags, rallying around the flag basically, but also with their own perspectives, talking about it, having speeches and so on. We went to quite a number of those in many, many cities.
It's really remarkable. It's really remarkable, I think, to see the support, the patriotism, the love for the country that many people in the West said that did not exist for the Iranians. That Iranians were ready to overthrow their so-called regime, and that was it. They didn't want to have it anymore. And in fact, the opposite occurred. People were defending their government. People were defending their nation. What did you see even from people who might not normally be part of the sort of would you say the religious part of the society, maybe those who are more liberal, reformist, maybe alternative? What did you see from them in these demonstrations, or maybe in interactions you had?
Well, of course, we went to a lot of the gatherings. We met a lot of people, but also, of course, Iranian people are posting online. There's quite a lot of online posts about these people who are otherwise not your typical Iranian patriots. Indeed, some Iranian posters are hunting down dissident people to show that, in a sense, some of them have even had a change of heart, but many of them are really rallying to support their country. So there's a lot of different sources of information there. It's true that the disinformation to the Western public has been extraordinary, really. And I think this has been a factor in the failure of the war against Iran. That on the one hand, they wanted to terrorize these people, and they thought that they told the public, and maybe they believed themselves, that this was a very unpopular so-called regime, and that it would collapse like a house of cards. Once you decapitated, murdered the leaders, then somehow or other the people would rise up and overthrow it. And I think that was the Hasbara narrative that the Israelis were telling Trump, and perhaps convincing Trump that this was going to be an easy type of thing. But the reverse has happened, really. The reverse has happened. There's extraordinary support for the government and the military. Even if people have political differences, they have really come out and far from collapsing. There's been this extraordinary high morale for people who are really being brutalized. There's a lot of killing going on. I think they killed about 2,000 people by the end of our trip with all these attacks. But as I said, Iran's a very big country, and these traumas are localized ones. We spoke to a lot of families that have been bereaved, but overall the morale of the Iranian people is extraordinary, really unusual to see in a war like this. But it's an unusual war too.
For sure. Let me ask you, one of the things that has been a concern of many, including myself as an Iranian in the diaspora, has been the use of ethnic divisions, this sectarianism, to sort of divide the Iranian nation and to kind of create some Yugoslavia type scenario, Syria type scenario, Iraq type scenario, sort of Balkanization, right? So pinning Kurds against Persians, Arabs against the rest, Baluchis, Turkomans, Azeris, you name it. There's so many different groups. Iran is a mosaic of peoples that have united around this civilization of thousands of years. Let me ask you, did you see other groups besides just sort of mainstream Persians, which are the majority? Did you see other groups, and how did they feel about Iran and about the government and their perspectives about the war?
Well, of course, you don't really see the difference really in many respects. There are a big variety of people, as you say. Iran is a big mosaic. It's multi-ethnic. Of course, it's true that the US and the Israelis have tried their best to try and foment that sort of divide and rule type of thing. And of course, I think Trump even admitted that he'd offered weapons to the Kurds in northern Iraq to get involved in this, and they decided that they'd been used one too many times, basically, for these sorts of operations. So you don't see that. You do see in the north, of course, you have Azeri people, that speak different languages. Also, you see some of that, but basically, you don't notice the difference. People come out. They come out into the cities. They wear what they wear. Of course, there's a huge diversity in the way that people dress in Iran, and you don't notice those things. Although I know that there's a great deal of effort has been placed over the years into trying to foment these types of divisions. And of course, not just between ethnicities, but also we know that the Mossad and the CIA were very heavily involved back in January in those assassinations of police and Basij and volunteers and so on like that. And they were people from all over the place. And they used, of course, refugees too. They used Afghans, they used Indians, they used other people. They used a number of athletes, to murder police, So and now you see these campaigns going on the internet. They're saying, oh, Iran's about to execute this person and for crimes against God or something like that. They don't mention that the person was convicted of murdering police officers or something like that. So that type of Hasbara propaganda is still going on. But I would say day to day, I don't really notice, unless people dress differently, you don't really notice their ethnicities, basically.
On that later note that you presented, let's dive. What did people say about what happened in January? Because of course, there's been a huge propaganda campaign, anywhere from 30,000 to over 100,000 killed. We've seen extraordinary numbers, like they inflate about everything in history, especially for the communist and socialist states. These enormous numbers killed, and what we end up realizing is that the numbers that the Iranian government has presented are the correct numbers and are verifiable. All other numbers are not verifiable. There's no evidence of anything like that. What did you hear on the ground of what happened in January? What did people say about what happened? And now we have confirmation that from the US government itself, that the US government had supplied weapons through Kurds, through the Kurdish regions, which we had known about before from John Bolton. He had announced it years ago that they were doing this. There was this sort of corridor of weapons transfers. What did you hear on the ground about that?
Well, people are very well aware of this. They're aware that the US had been arming and funding the Mujahideen Khalq to the MEK, that group that's now based in Albania. And they're hated because they were employed by Saddam Hussein in the Iran-Iraq war, and they killed many Iranian people before they became effectively guns for hire and funded by the Saudis. And because you mentioned John Bolton, I was reminded of them because I think him or some of the other Trump officials were getting paid to go over and give some sort of pep talks in Albania to them or something.
Correct.
Or maybe it was in France before they even moved to Albania. So people are very well aware of that. Of course, what happened there are also many people on the streets who themselves were involved in protests. Either some women against the dress regulations. That's been going on for decades, frankly. Young women have been doing that. Of course, the US tried to co-opt the anti-hijab feeling into a regime change operation. But really the truth is young women had been doing this, had been basically subverting the dress code for decades. Even when I first went to Iran 9 years ago, most women were wearing a very loose scarf in case they passed a shrine or a mosque or something, and someone complained, they would just pull the scarf up onto their head. So that was a campaign that had been going on for a very long time. So women that I've seen reports, many women who had been involved in some sort of protest, and some who were involved in economic protests, because there were some general economic protests in the past, but the specific ones in December last year were when the currency was crashed. The currency was crashed by some outside hedge funds, basically in the employ of Iran's enemies, and the rial devalued something like 40% in a couple of days. So they called it the bazaris, the bazaar merchants who were affected by that, because not everyone's affected immediately by a change in the value of the currency, because a lot of prices are relatively stable and in local currency. And fuel, for example, is about 1 cent a litre. 1 cent a litre to put it into your car or your motorbike or whatever like that. So But the bazaar merchants, the people selling things and selling gold and currency and so on, were affected by that devaluation. They came out in late December, and the government, the leader and the president admitted that they had legitimate grievances and were going to address them. There was no violence, there was no police repression. That was in the final days of December. The actual violence that took place in January was a bit later on, about 10 days later on the 8th and 9th of January. And it's very well known, it's notorious now, and people who were involved in economic protests were commenting on this, that they were wondering why, you know, children and police and Basij were being killed by these armed people, basically. So it's very well known in Iran that someone was arming these people to in some respects randomly shoot people, but also to shoot officials and organizers, you know, volunteer organizers and so on. So that's fairly well known. You speak to well-educated people and they understand what was going on there. They weren't fooling people. The theory was they were trying to incite some sort of uprising, but people were very aware that something very evil was going on there. And as you say, the Iranian government published the actual names, you know, the identification details of the 3,117 people who were killed, and it included 200 police and 100 Basij, you know. So it reminds me of some of the fake protests in Syria many years ago, basically. But it was fabricated. They admitted it was fabricated. The Mossad, the Israeli TV stations, the former head of the CIA, Pompeo, all admitted before Trump recently made his admissions that it was armed from outside, and it was intended to give the impression that there were a lot of agents working for the regime change operations. And of course, the Pahlavis, by the way, the monarchists in Iran are actually quite extraordinary. They are quite openly supporting Trump's war against Iran. You know, I think that it gets them any goodwill inside Iran for that, because people are horrified. People are rallying around the flag. Really, the support for the government has increased enormously, I would suggest. Many, as I said, I've seen reports of many people who were involved in protests who nevertheless came out to support the government. Indeed, some had their views changed, basically, by the fact that they saw that the young men were defending their country now, and they were retaliating against the Israelis. Of course, this was happening in the 12-day war last year too. A friend was telling me that some of the people who were opposition people were cheering on the missiles going back at Israel in the 12-day war, basically. So the attack on Iran has really generated a very big counter reaction amongst Iranian people, and this wasn't counted on. I don't know what Trump believed, you know, but it has a whiff of people believing their own bullshit. You know, that the danger of believing your own bullshit is you think this is a weak regime, it's going to collapse. We murdered the leader, we murdered some of the IRGC commanders, and everyone hates the government, therefore they're going to overthrow it. No, that didn't happen at all. The state is very deep. The resilience of the people is very, very deep, and this nation and this state actually has weathered the storm very effectively, very powerfully, really. Perhaps it wasn't expected. I don't know if they believed their own bullshit, but if they did, they made a very serious mistake, because Trump is now in a very difficult position. He's desperate to get out. He's looking for a way out. I think the Israelis want to sabotage the exit of the US, because they would like the US to keep going. They won't keep going themselves. The Israelis made it very clear they weren't going to be part of any ground invasion. It looks like no one wants to be part of any ground invasion. Not the separatist Kurds, not the US, not the Israelis, not anyone, basically. But the Israelis certainly want the US to persist with this. They would like to sabotage any of the talks that are going on at the moment. Although, of course, the talks at the moment have their own problems, you know, because the Israelis are still slaughtering people in Lebanon. They're treating Lebanon like Gaza now. There's some terrible carnage going on in Lebanon at the moment. And they're talking about the Lebanese and about the Iranians the same way they talk about Gaza, you know, like they're Amalek, you know, the whole people are a plague and an enemy which has to be annihilated, basically. Trump got to that point, didn't he, when he was talking about wiping out civilization too, you know. So these sort of, which was a statement which was condemned by the Pope, apparently, the North American Pope that they have these days. So really, I don't know what they believe, but certainly they had some very serious wrong impressions about how Iran was going to respond to this attack. And of course, even the Europeans have reacted badly. And it looks like they're seeking out their own separate relationships with Iran. France has already got one ship through. They've realized that I'm talking about the Straits of Hormuz here, that that the straits were never closed, but they were closed to those linked to the US regime and those supporting the US regime, which is carrying out these terrorist attacks. And Iran has made it clear they're going to keep the security clearance on the straits, basically. I think that's becoming accepted. At least half the world is now talking to Iran to negotiate their own way, and you know, Iraq is getting its ships through, and China and Pakistan and Bangladesh and India are getting their ships through. But Iran has a new tool, and that's given it a lot of leverage in the current circumstances. It's created a lot of grief for Trump. It's increased the anxiety of Trump to get out because he knows he can't do a ground invasion. They were talking about it for a long time. He knows he can't break the control of Hormuz there. He knows that his image is plummeting. He's looking for some off-ramp, as they say. Many analysts recognize this, but it's difficult. But I think he's inclined to what's important. There's a rift growing between the Israelis and the Trump administration, because whatever the rhetoric is, basically, I think the Trump administration really wants to find a way out of this one.
For sure. I'll address some other points. We'll get back to some of the other ones. But since you mentioned the Strait, I wanted to share, you had posted, and this is on your X. For those who aren't following you, please do. But let's just play this short clip, which you had posted. I believe
So that's Hormuz Island. You can see it there in the middle on the left of the screen, and Hashim Island is on the right. There's a third island behind them, and between the third island and Hormuz is the strait, the northern strait. The whole strait itself is I think 21 miles or something, but the strait the ships pass through is much narrower than that. You know, with the deep channel, it's only 2 or 3 kilometers basically. So we're quite close there. Most of those ships are Iranian, basically. They're waiting offshore because the US or the Israelis or both were bombing some of the ports, and they felt more vulnerable at port. We were going to go out to Hormuz Island, and they bombed the port on Hormuz Island the night before, you know, so we were sitting out in a boat rather than going to the island itself, because there were drones in the air, basically. But they're mainly Iranian ships hanging offshore there, with some tankers amongst them, and they're on the Iranian side of the strait, basically.
Yeah. So you were one of the first, I think, Western journalists in the Strait, along with the whole team that was there. Thinking about geography, power, and sort of the rights of the Iranian nation, as well as Oman, which share that 12 kilometers or so that is allowed under international law as sort of territorial waters. Really, this has become sort of the chokehold of the entire global economy. You know, people didn't really realize the power, and I think people underestimated Iran's capabilities, much to their own, you know, chagrin, I think, because now they've realized that Iran can not only project power, it can hold the strait, and it doesn't need to have a navy to hold the strait necessarily. It can do it with less resources, but it really has a control over this area. What did you see being out there and sort of the geography of power that Iran has there to its advantage?
Well, first of all, the US warships are a long way away. They haven't dared to come close the whole time. They haven't even tried to breach the straits into the Persian Gulf. They know, because they know there's a huge battery of anti-ship missiles and medium-range missiles along the mountainous or hilly sea cliffs of the Persian Gulf on the Iranian side. You know, on the Iraqi side it's flatter, but on the Iranian side it's very mountainous. There's a lot of cliffs, and there's a lot of underground ordnance, basically, and the US has not even tried to breach it. They've been too worried to do it. And of course, you know, that biggest aircraft carrier they had in the region, that just went home in the middle of everything, basically, the Gerald Ford, because they claimed there was some internal reasons, but I think the fire on board, it was a pretty serious fire on board. There was 200 people injured, and it's back in port in Crete, I believe, and looks like the repairs could take more than a year. So effectively, the most expensive warship in history retreated in the middle of a war and is out of action for more than a year. So whether it was hit by Iranian drones or not, it's a bit of a sign of how useless those sorts of investments are these days. of course, those carriers have planes which were being used to fly in and bomb Iran. But the problem is the range of those planes is not that big, so they have to refuel, and that's why they got the C-130s, two of which crashed in Isfahan, by the way. But they have to refuel them because they can't just go in and come back if the ship's sitting 700 or 800 kilometers out into the Arabian Sea or the Gulf of Oman or something like that. So none of the US warships got very close. There is some traffic, as you know. We saw some signs of Chinese and Pakistani boats going through, basically. But there's the regulatory system we were being told about. I was reading Iranian reports. We had an interview with the governor of Hormuzgan province, and I was traveling. Our media group I was traveling with, there was a specialist reporter on the energy sector who knew about the regulatory regime. So we're being updated as we traveled in terms of what was going on there, basically. And probably you've heard a lot of the details already. They're trying to stress the toll or the tax that's being imposed. But I think the most important thing to start with is its security clearance. The Iranians don't want supply to the US bases that have been used to attack them. They don't want weapons brought in. And so they are, but of course they have most of the world now because of the Europeans. I think it's only really the British that have engaged with the US in supporting this war. Of course, the Persian Gulf monarchies stupidly and they were warned, but they've maintained these bases which were used to attack Iran. And now they're crying victim, but they wonder why. The Iranians told them a long time ago, if you get involved, if you're complicit in this attack on us, we're going to hit the bases in your states. There's been a bit of devilry going on in the sense that the Israelis, I think, made an attack inside Oman, and I think they attacked a desalination plant too. In other words, they were trying to blame some things on Iran that Iran hadn't done, but certainly Iran had struck and either partially or completely destroyed the US base, 13 US bases in the Persian Gulf on the other side there. So massive damage been done to those US bases while they were retaliating against the Israelis, basically. So that's given the US more pause to thought, because the Iranians want to get rid of the US presence from the region completely. Of course, they'd like to get rid of the Israelis from the region completely too. Whether they'll do the job completely is another question, basically. But Hormuz is certainly key to the leverage that Iran now has, as you say, on the global economy. 20% of the oil and the gas is going through there. I think 30% or more of the fertilizer also coming through there. The Saudis have a very big fertilizer industry. It's a byproduct of petrochemicals too. So there's an enormous impact on the global economy when things are slowed down there, but there is a way in, and the way in is to talk to the Iranians and get an agreement with them that you're not going to be any threat to them, basically. And that's really the licensing system that's been de facto by the IRGC, and now there's a law. They just recently passed a law in the Iranian parliament to regularize that. I believe down the track they're going to include the Sultanate of Oman. They're going to get Oman involved because Oman, they have good relationships with Oman. Oman is agreeable with getting involved in this security regulation, basically. And interestingly, I think this is an important addition. The big insurance companies, which are basically part of the Anglo-American empire, the shipping insurance like Lloyd's of London, they recognized some time back, at least even before we got to Hormuz, that effectively a security clearance by the IRGC would serve to reduce the premium risk on insurance for the ships. And that makes a difference between passing through and not passing through. So even though the Anglo-Americans control the financialized insurance system, they're not waiting around for Trump to give some sort of green light to anything. They've already done it. They recognize that an IRGC security clearance is going to keep the shipping safe, and they'll reduce the premium to the point that it's actually worth the while to send the ship through the strait safely.
No, it's really amazing how Iran has been able to utilize the Strait of Hormuz in the way it has. And I want to ask about one aspect of that, which is the use of the Chinese yuan, the renminbi, versus the dollar. So this move from petrodollar to petro yuan, as some are saying, this is a big change, I think. And economically speaking of counter hegemonic studies, counter hegemony, is really countering the dollar's supremacy in many aspects, especially with the economic system that we have at this point. So I'm trying to make sense for a lot of people that this is a big moment. This is a big moment where in a conflict, we've seen a nation switch currencies for a major strategic asset. In the midst of it, from one camp to another. And I think that this is a historic moment, a sort of axial moment, as we say in history. What do you think about that? What do you think about the deepening ties? Of course, China and Iran have deep ties. They are connected not only by ports and sort of the intermodal cargo facilities, but also by rail, which was last year. They connected by rail, and then you had the 12-day war. So I'm wondering how you see this and how you think this is going to play out over the coming years with the developing multipolar world.
Well, on the last point, I think it's true that the rail has gone through, the rail from China to Tehran. But as I understand, and people were telling me it's not fully functional yet, it's not working. It'll be working sometime later this year, I believe. And that will be a way for them to send oil and all sorts of other things and receive all sorts of things too. So that's going to help Iran sort of break the blockade. Because remember, Iran has been under this terrible economic blockade for a very long time now. And of course, it was Obama in 2012 who blackmailed the SWIFT system, which is not a US thing, it's a European thing. It's, what is it, based in Belgium or somewhere in Central Europe there, which is, the exchange of information between banks, not the actual transaction, but the exchange of information. The US effectively got control of that specifically to force the SWIFT system to block Iran's participation in international banking. Prior to that, the Obama regime was imposing massive fines on European banks that were found to have done transactions with Iran and with Cuba. Iran and Cuba were the two big bête noirs for the Obama regime. Bush wasn't doing it. It was Obama that did that initiative there. It wasn't widely reported on at the time, but we found out later on that the OFAC, the section of the US Treasury which deals with these sorts of things, was publishing the size of the so-called fines that were being imposed on European banks. And they were massive. Some of them were over $1 billion, a fine for breaching US law, which wasn't a breach of European law, So in this way, the US had been exporting its extraterritorial laws to impose blockades on others. So Iran, in other words, has had to avoid normal banking systems, which are dominated by the US for 13, 14 years now, basically. So bilateral swaps within the BRICS countries, like using the yuan, is one way it was doing it. I don't think it's the only way that they're doing it at the moment. It's true that there are oil transactions in yuan now, but I'm not totally convinced that the Chinese are happy that the yuan simply becomes a substitute for the US dollar. I think the Chinese see some downsides to that. They don't want an overvalued yuan. It's going to hurt their trade too. So, but certainly Iran has to avoid the SWIFT system, for which the US has it blocked from. So I believe some of the other digital currencies are being used, the USDT, through a certain protocol. I don't fully understand the whole thing, but there are some other ways of doing exchange. But certainly the petro-yuan is a spectre that's haunting the petrodollar, basically. And there may be some other ways to avoid it. Of course, the BRICS don't yet have an alternative currency, and the bilateral swaps have been the most important thing in BRICS there. But certainly they have to avoid the SWIFT system, because that's been, the US dollar dictatorship has really made great use of, trying to confine people to the dollar. On the other hand, they banned others from the dollar. They banned the Cubas and the Irans of the world from the dollar. But there are some digital ways to get around it, and using other currencies is another way to get around it. Of course, they still need a banking system to deal with yuan or whatever else it is, basically. So in that sense, I think the world is waiting with bated breath on some alternative financial architecture to the dollar. And it's certainly the denomination of barrels of oil is a very, very important factor. And it's going to lead to a further devaluation of the US dollar, which has only been happening gradually so far, because there are so many states invested in or with big dollar reserves that no one really wants the dollar to collapse quickly. But at some stage, there's going to be, the diversification, as they call it, has been going on for some time. And certainly the denomination of oil from the Persian Gulf in other currencies is going to seriously dent the import of the US dollar. And as little Marco Rubio said, how are they going to sanction anyone if people are not using the dollar anymore, basically? So they know the Trump administration and his ministers know that their power, their financial power, is going to be undermined by the BRICS alternatives, but the rest of the world is going to be certainly have a boot from off their neck when that happens, not just Iran, many other countries.
No, absolutely. I think you're spot on about that. Moving now to a little bit of a bigger picture, what is the sort of perspective of Iranians on the ground and the people you spoke to about the relationship of Iran with Russia and China? We've seen some people in the West condemn Russia and China for not doing enough. They should get involved. But I think it's important to recognize that Iran does not have a mutual military treaty with Russia or China for them to participate in armed conflict in case Iran is attacked. There's no sort of, Article 5 that NATO has. There's no equivalent with Iran, and there's no Warsaw Pact anymore. We're in a totally different sort of situation now. I wanted to ask you, because of that criticism, what is the feeling on the ground about Iran's relationship with Russia and with China? I know the Iranian ambassador to Russia, and he's very supportive of the relationship with Russia. In fact, we're all the time together here in Moscow. But I want to ask you, what's the feeling on the ground in Iran?
Well, look, I think that there is a lot of background support in intelligence, in logistics, and in some of the satellite imagery and so on. Certainly from China, we know that China had been helping with their alternative to GPS, for example, and the satellite imaging and the components for Iran's missile program. And we know there's been some cooperation between Russia and Iran over the, I think Russia is effectively remanufacturing some of the Iranian designs of drones, for use in their current war too. So you're right, there isn't this sort of Article 5 obligation to get involved. And I should point out, I saw the Russian president saying that Iran hasn't asked for that. The Iranian government hasn't asked for that, but certainly they've been getting technical assistance and logistic assistance and intelligence assistance. And from the Chinese point of view, someone's pointed out to me recently that China has this historical habit of, they certainly want to reduce the hegemonic dominance of the US, there's no doubt about that, but they are trying everything they can to avoid direct ideological conflicts. Basically, they have this sort of, or maybe it's irritating to other people, but they operate in a way that avoids the direct confrontation. I suppose you could say that the Russia did the same thing, because remember when they intervened in Syria to help the Syrians, it was not to oppose the US plot against Syria, it was to oppose terrorism in Syria. So Russia was actually helping the Syrian Arab Army at that time fight terrorist groups, which the US falsely claimed that they were fighting, ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra and so on. So in other words, the President Putin, probably conscious of the problems that the Soviet Union had in Afghanistan there, where they tended to substitute for the former Afghan army rather than simply help it, that he was trying to avoid those sorts of traps, and he was trying to avoid a direct ideological confrontation with the US. And that more or less happened. They shared information. They didn't get involved in direct military confrontations. It was unnecessary for that purpose. Even with the Israelis, Russia didn't get involved there because, as you know, Russia has this ambiguous relationship with the Israelis at the least, let's say, and they avoided unnecessary conflicts. They were there to help fight terrorism. So Russia and China have both avoided a direct, overt hegemonic contest with the US and with its NATO allies in Iran, as in Syria. But certainly they were helping, and in some respects, the Iranians preferred it that way, because the Iranians are proud people. They have their own defense industries. They're proud of their own accomplishments with drones and with missiles, which are their major deterrent, basically. In the Persian Gulf, which is very shallow, they have these mini submarines. They have this Mosquito fleet. They have naval torpedoes and underwater drones and things like that. So they've got their own arsenal. I think they were certainly benefited from the satellite assistance from the Chinese. There was some coordination there. The US was complaining about it. I don't know why they were complaining about it, but and there was a Chinese ship offshore down there, the US warships at the time. So I think on the ground, people understand that there is some background support going on there, which isn't overt. And really, of course, and to some extent, like in Syria, most of the advances on the ground in Syria were being made by the Syrian Arab Army at one time, until its command collapsed later in the day. But certainly people were very proud of the fact that it was their military that was defeating the US in its region. Everyone knew that this was going to be a logistic contest that the US and the Israelis were both running out of interception missiles and ordnance. They were a long way from home and running out of ammunition, basically. And everyone knew it was one of those sort of attrition wars, basically, and that played out. Some people in Iran, I believe now, are worried that this pause in talks for a ceasefire, which there wasn't a lot of appetite for, by the way. People really wanted the Iranians, when they had the military, when they had the advantage, to keep on pressing their advantage and force more overt concessions and retreats by the US in particular, and also by the Israelis. So I think they're proud of their military doing it and being seen to be doing it by themselves, basically. But I think they were aware that the help from their BRICS partners, and of course the economic assistance too, is there. People are very aware that economic relationship is building, and that's important for supply chains and so on too.
Absolutely. And speaking of the relationship with some of their partners, of course, the Axis of Resistance, of which you wrote a great book. If people have not read it, I suggest that people go out there and read your book on the Axis of Resistance. It's a few years in print, but I think it's still very valuable for understanding the context and the history. I wanted to ask, so this war of aggression launched by the Israelis and the Americans against Iran brought in as well the Popular Mobilization Forces and other Shia-aligned groups in Iraq. We saw that Yemen got involved as well. You traveled to Yemen about a month before I traveled there with our team. So you have on the ground experience as we do, and you were able to see what's going on in Yemen. Also, we saw that Israel basically committed one of the largest ethnic cleansings, the largest since the Nakba, and even larger in terms of population displacement. We saw that over 1 million people have been displaced from south of the Litani River. So we've seen that this conflict has spread far and wide. It also, Syria was involved as well. Some groups were claimed to get involved, and there was also Israeli incursion through Syrian territory into Lebanon. I want to ask you, what's the state of the Axis of Resistance today, and where do you see it going from here, from this point?
Well, we've seen, you're right to draw attention to that, because it's very important. The regional war has always been a single war, basically, and the allies in the Axis of Resistance have some important roles to play. The Yemenis have reactivated, as you will have seen, in the Red Sea in terms of preventing supply to the Israeli enemy. The Hezbollah re-entered the war against the Israelis after the attack on Iran and the retaliation on Iran, and it entered with a lot of ordnance. It was surprising to a lot of people, I think, the way in which the force with which Hezbollah entered. It stopped the invasion from the south, basically. I believe it's thwarted also an invasion from the Bekaa, from the Syrian side, and from Mount Hermon, or Jabal al-Sheikh, although the Israelis have shown themselves taking advantage of their occupation of Syrian territory and going in through the mountains, as well as trying to get in through the Bekaa, but they've been repelled by Hezbollah. The Iranians spent a long time rebuilding, helping the resistance in Lebanon rebuild, and we're seeing the results of that now. And the Israeli response to that, to getting smashed in the south, basically. I mean, they're claiming huge numbers of tanks that they've destroyed in the south. The Israeli response has been to bomb civilians. Their tactic in Gaza, their tactic in Iran, really, when they can't stop the resistance, when they can't stop the retaliation, they'll go for civilians, and basically take hostages. And it's an old fascist tactic. The resistance in the village attacks you. You say you're going to kill 100 civilians for every one resistance fighter, or every one imperial soldier that's killed, basically. And of course now, again, sadly, they're bombing Beirut, the capital, because the Lebanese state is in such a poor state. It's never been able to get an air defense. Lebanon has been vulnerable from the air for a very long time, and because of the political system there, because also they have the worst type of government at the moment, the worst prime minister and president, unable to defend the country, talking about trying to disarm the resistance, which is the only thing that's defending the country from an invasion. But they're unable to set up a system to even stop bombing from the air of the capital city, and hundreds of people have been killed in recent days, basically. So nevertheless, Hezbollah had effectively stopped once again, before the ceasefire, and once again they've stopped an Israeli incursion from the south. They haven't been able to come up and take the Litani River. They haven't got anywhere near the Litani River yet because of the resistance by Hezbollah. Hezbollah, by the way, supported by a number of other resistance groups. Remember, the resistance in the south of Lebanon has always involved fighters from the Palestinian factions, almost all the Palestinian factions, from some other Lebanese factions like Amal, even including some Muslim Brotherhood groups. So there's been a very wide range of allied support for Hezbollah, but nevertheless, Hezbollah is the one that's developed the greater capacity to resist the Israelis in the south, and they know the terrain in the south very well. The Yemenis, of course, stayed out of things for a while in this war. Latest, they called the Ramadan War of the Israelis and the US against Iran, but more recently they've entered at least on the Red Sea axis, and there's been some ordnance towards the Israeli cities in the south again. So they've entered in a rather restrained way at the moment. The Hashd al-Shabi, the forces in Iraq, which, by the way, are Sunni Muslim as well as Shia Muslim. When I was there 9 years ago, they pointed out to me that even though it arose as a result of a fatwa by the senior Shia authority, nevertheless, there were other factions, other resistance factions in the popular mobilization forces, some of which became involved in state security and some of which stayed outside, basically. So they have been involved in chasing the remnants of the US forces out of Iraq. But unfortunately, the US has established these institutional mechanisms in Iraq by federating it, by dismantling the Ba'ath Party, by establishing these military and financial links, which they all the revenue from oil sales have been going to New York and then being shipped back in cash to Iraq. Some extraordinary, strange mechanisms which keep Iraq still subject to direct control of the finances of Iraq. So Iraq has an independent political will. They're struggling to get out. You saw how badly Trump reacted to the potential nomination of Nouri al-Maliki as coming back as prime minister again. He was very worried about that. But nevertheless, there is some incipient political will coming back into Iraq, and that will mean that they will come to the aid of Iran if Iran is attacked again. I think in Syria, there's a very minimal type of resistance to the Gilani regime there, but it may be enough to stop Gilani sending some of the foreign fighters into Lebanon itself, which has been threatening for some time. I heard, by the way, that Hezbollah has been able to purchase some weapons or material for weapons from Syria because the level of corruption in the Gilani regime is such that politics is no barrier to people making money out of this, basically. So it hasn't been an absolute block to the old practice, which a lot of weapons were being manufactured in Syria and sent to the Palestinians, although they blocked the tunnels for that and sent to the Lebanese resistance. But I believe that some weapons or some ordnance or some components of weapons are still being purchased on the Syrian side there, basically. So, and there are new mechanisms, basically, that Iran has of getting weapons to the resistance in Palestine and in Lebanon, basically. So it hasn't been an absolute. The fall of Syria was a huge blow to the regional resistance, no doubt about that. To some extent, it was compensated by the entry of Yemen, an independent Yemen, which had basically defeated the assaults led by the Saudis. But it's still alive very much, and Iranians are helping rebuild it. And of course, this is why they've gone for Iran, because Iran has always been, since 1979, has been the main sponsor of the Palestinian resistance, which has kept the Palestinian people alive, giving them the means to defend themselves effectively, which is the same thing with the Lebanese resistance. Basically, Iran is simply giving them the means to defend themselves against these terrible incursions by the Zionists and the imperialists. So the axis of resistance is certainly not dead. Hezbollah has proven itself to be a force that has reborn after terrible losses that they suffered during that war and some serious failures that they had. Their communication system was cracked. Their communication system has been rebuilt. So the axis of resistance has not gone away, and the victory of Iran over the Israelis and over Trump is something that's going to give a huge morale boost, that we haven't seen for a long time, not even greater than the morale boost when Hezbollah defeated Israel back in 2006. The fact that Iran is looking like emerging victorious against the big hegemon in the world, with its particular lever over the Straits of Hormuz and causing massive damage every day for 40 days to the Israelis is going to change the perceptions in the region very substantially.
Absolutely. Having you on the show, I cannot help but ask you about Syria. You were very much involved in defending Syria. You traveled multiple times. You were able to meet with former President Bashar al-Assad, and your work was widely seen and praised by many in the anti-imperialist camp for being clear and objective and very much in defense, in line with our principles and values. And you suffered as a result of that from the West and from sort of the hegemonic forces that were against defending Syria and for the regime change. I want to ask you, people are now calling for a post-mortem. Blame Russia, blame Iran, who's to blame for the fall of Syria? But I want to ask you generally, what happened in late 2024 and where do we go from here? Will this government of Jolani/al-Shara last? Because for me, Syria is still a very diverse country. It has a lot of political forces and ethnic and religious forces that I don't think necessarily agree with the government in Damascus. Certainly, I think that they are even more concerned with the violence of that government now, which has committed atrocities against Christians, Druze, against Alawites, against other populations. What do you make of that? What do you make of what happened, sort of your post-mortem, and what's to come?
Well, in the last point, I don't think the regime of Jolani will last. He served a purpose for the imperial forces and Zionist forces. He got rid of Assad. He destroyed the role of Syria as a supplier, an ordnance supplier to the resistance in Palestine and in Lebanon. That was the point of it all the time, the point of all of the propaganda about Syria and, the sectarian propaganda against the Assad government. But look, I think the sad truth is that a lot of the command was purchased by the enemy, basically. And then Russia had to respond to that. Iran offered help, which was refused. President Assad, in his own way of thinking, who was a pan-Arabist and he was aware that Syria was one of the founders of the Arab League, thought he could persuade the Persian Gulf monarchies that Syria was worth investing in again. And he made a lot of concessions to them, including kicking out the Ansarallah ambassador, by the way, from Yemen, and distancing himself somewhat from Iran, he didn't want Iranian troops in Syria, even when they were offered, for example. But look, Russia was in Syria in a limited way for air power, for intelligence. All of the fighting was being done. The gains that were being made against the terrorist groups in Syria were being made by the Syrian Arab Army, which was a very disciplined force. And at times they worked with Qassad, with the Syrian Democratic Forces when they had to, and they got over the past grievances with Hamas when they had to, when Hamas changed its ways and when the Gaza massacres began. So they were a disciplined army, but I discovered that from talking to people that there were a number of the senior commanders were purchased by the enemy. Of course, by the enemy, I mean by Erdogan's regime and the money bags behind it in Qatar, basically. And it wasn't a sectarian split. And we know the names of many of the generals that effectively betrayed the army and called on them to fall back. And when they were called to fall back, when there was that the offensive by Jolani's forces, which began after the ceasefire in Lebanon, when the Israelis were effectively pushed back from southern Lebanon, unable to take over southern Lebanon because of the resistance in Lebanon, despite the assassination of Nasrallah and many others. That offensive, I don't think anyone knew exactly how successful it would be, but it was successful because there were commands from the command structure to pull back and not to engage and not to fight. And the traitor generals remained in Syria, most of them. And they kept collaborating from Damascus and from some parts of Tartus with Jolani, including chasing people who'd been involved in killing their comrades, basically. In other words, the Syrian Arab Army, there were scores to settle because the army had killed many ISIS and Nusra and HTS terrorists over that time, basically. Even MEK, I found when I was visiting one front line next to Idlib, in the mountains on the west side of Idlib, that the Syrian army at that time had killed 3 Mujahideen Khalq Iranian terrorists in Idlib. Up until then, I didn't know that they were actually being used in Syria. Everyone assumed that they were being used only against Iran, basically. But so there were many different types of mercenaries being used to try and maintain that Idlib enclave and build it up for that offensive. But had the Syrian army's command held together, they would have been able to resist that invasion, I believe. So the loyal loyal to the Republic generals, let's say, are both mainly in Russia these days. With you and I maybe you know more about it than I do, basically, but many of them went to Russia. The commander-in-chief, of course, is in Russia, and it's just been announced recently that he set up some optometry business or medical practice, basically, there as a refugee. But look, I think Russia made the best of a bad situation, basically. I don't think Russia betrayed them. There was some inconsistency in the way that Russia behaved. For example, there's a lot of grievances in Syria about the Russians because some of the major massacres on the coast took place very close to the airbase where the Russians were. Then there were some decisions, and so why didn't the Russians prevent that? The Russians took some refugees into the airbase and protected them. They issued some arms there, but then they were countermanded on that. So there was some inconsistency. There were some specific things that make some Syrians, particularly on the coast, resent the role of Russia there. Some people also thought Russia should save us, but I think the Russian position was this, and I think Iran's position was this too, that if the Syrian army had fallen apart and couldn't defend the country, they couldn't do it for them, basically. They could help the Syrian Arab army. They couldn't replace or substitute for the Syrian Arab army. I think that's the situation that certainly Iran was faced with, that situation, and I think Russia made the best of a bad situation there too. And you can blame the president, the commander-in-chief, for bad selection of commanders, because it wasn't a sectarian split. We know that there were, on the traitors' side, there were Alawis and there were all the different types of sects that the commanders came from. It wasn't a split on sectarian grounds. The Syrian Arab army was always a nationalist army. It really didn't break on sectarian grounds at any time, basically, but it was betrayed by some of those commanders who we believe were paid by Qatar through Erdogan's regime, basically. That's a great tragedy, really. And then the fact that resistance has not been able to get a focus or a leadership, basically, to reassert itself. They were intimidated, of course, because there was some resistance on the coast, and then that triggered those terrible massacre of civilians, which was intended to intimidate Gaza style. And while it didn't work in Gaza, it did work on the coast, I think. And so the Alawi community was very divided about their approaches to things there, and in lack of leadership. From time to time, you hear that there has been some individual acts of resistance, basically, but it's small at the moment and relatively marginal. Some of it is coming from Qassad, of course, from the Kurdish separatists in the northeast, who were let down by their Turkish comrades, basically being disarmed in Turkey. But they have been unhappy to surrender to Giuliani or be incorporated into Giuliani's forces, and there has been some acts of rebellion there. So I don't know exactly what's going on there at this stage. Potentially there was the potential for a alliance between some of the disaffected factions. Not so much the Druze, because the Druze have always felt they're too small and they needed some sort of shelter, basically. And the argument coming from the colonized Druze in occupied Palestine, unfortunately, has been convincing to some of them there, because I think they thought perhaps that having some protection from the Israelis was better than being prey to Giuliani and being massacred simply on Takfiri grounds, basically. So they're in a very difficult situation there. As you said, every minority has been attacked in Syria there, but there still isn't a generalized coalition, hasn't coalesced yet. I think that the Islamic resistance in Lebanon probably is going to support some elements of that at some stage. And of course, there have been attacks on some of the occupying Israelis at times in the south. But as I said, it's fairly small and fragmented so far. But nevertheless, there isn't a state there, effectively. Giuliani doesn't have a state. He hasn't been able to pull together a state. I know some friends in the Palestinian communities in Syria who were Sunni Muslims basically, but they were attacked and tortured and jailed because they were close to the army, because they were close to Assad, because Assad supported all of the Palestinian factions, despite some of the differences with Hamas. The Syrian Arab Army and President Assad supported the Palestinian factions, and therefore they were subject to the wrath of some of Jalani's henchmen, basically. But they have simply put their heads down. Many people have been in survival mode, I believe, for the last year and a half, basically, in Syria, trying to see how they're going to deal with those that haven't left the country. Are trying to see how they can put their heads down, survive, and reinvent some lifestyle for themselves just to get through this. But there is no real national government in Damascus. Basically, it's a regime that's serving the interests of the US at the moment and the Israelis. Thankfully, they haven't yet been deployed against Lebanon or against Palestine. But of course, everyone knows they've done nothing for Palestine. Basically, they haven't even prevented the Israelis taking over and occupying much more Syrian territory, almost up to Damascus and across to the Lebanese border.
My last question for you, and I want to thank you because this has really been, I don't know if you can see the comments, but people are very enthusiastic for your responses, comprehensive and in-depth analysis. I know you don't have a crystal ball. I wish we did, because that would certainly help. But right now we have Iranian diplomats, Iranian political leaders in Islamabad. We have Vice President J.D. Vance of the U.S. and the entire team of the U.S. there as well. Hundreds of people are there trying to discuss these terms of the ceasefire, so-called ceasefire, which has already been broken, but we'll get to that. I want to ask you, what happens after this? What do you expect? What are people in Iran saying? What are you thinking about this ceasefire? And will it last? Will there be peace? Or are we headed back into another round of violence and war?
Look, there could be another round of violence because the Israelis wanted to go ahead and they are staging provocations to sabotage it. At the same time, the Trump regime is desperate to get out. They're desperate for a way out. Trump didn't anticipate the war would go on this long, that he would get hammered, that strategic areas would be taken from their control. They wouldn't be able to stop the Iranians enforcing a security regulation on Hormuz. This is being blamed on Trump for his ill-conceived war. The NATO allies haven't supported him in this, only the British, basically, and even the British are ambiguous about it. The Europeans, for their part, because most of the people getting fuel from the Persian Gulf are the Europeans and the Asians, basically. Most of the Asians are quite happy to deal with Iran and get some security clearance there. They haven't joined into this war, so most of the Asian states are dealing with it one way or the other. France has got one ship through. The president of Germany has criticized Trump's war very seriously. So it's quite likely that other European states who have been damaged by Trump, by the US after, not just by Trump, by the US after all, by Biden before Trump, basically through the blockade of Russia, basically, and damaged in their energy security and their food security. There may be more Europeans that break ranks and go and do diplomatic deals with Iran, and they'll do it, and they'll get their fuel from the Persian Gulf. Basically, they'll reopen some of the relationships they have, if not with Iran, with some of the other Persian Gulf monarchies, if those monarchies are not rearming the US bases so they can attack Iran again, basically. So there are some conditions there, but it's open to all of the European states pretty much who have not participated in the attacks on Iran to go and get their IRGC security clearance and then get their risk discount on their shipping insurance and start to do business again. In other words, the Straits of Hormuz are not closed. They're just closed to the enemies of Iran, which are attacking Iran. Probably the Australians who have been some of the most supine slaves of the US and have their own air base in the UAE, for example, would be denied, basically. But I think the Australians buy refined fuel from other parts of the world anyway. So I think that Trump is still looking for a way out, and this was the only thing in it for Iran, basically, that if the talks in Pakistan could provide some pretext for Trump to find some trophy to go away and say, look, I won, when he's obviously retreating, which is basically what's going to happen. You see US analysts like John Mearsheimer are saying Trump has no alternative but to surrender, basically, complete surrender. But of course, we know Trump's ego. We know his concern about his image, that he's looking for something. Clearly, he was looking for a trophy when he did that stupid operation in Isfahan, which was trying to infiltrate one of the nuclear facilities there, basically. And then he lied about it being an attempt to rescue a pilot. Really, they were trying to get some trophy uranium out of one of the processing sites in Isfahan, and it failed very badly. They lost somewhere between 6 and 12 aircraft there, which are now being scavenged by the scrap metal dealers in Iran, picking up a bonus from all of this high-tech junk, basically. So Trump is looking for something to hang on to hang his hat on and say, look, I didn't fail completely. Here's what I got, basically. Can the Iranians help him pull some rabbit out of the hat so he doesn't look as bad as he already looks? He knows that he is losing. He knows that he could look worse than he does already. He's avoided the body bag scenario. He avoided a ground invasion of Kark Island or any of the other islands or any of the other parts of Iran. There's been no invasion of Iran so far. They know that it will be a disaster for them because of the mountainous terrain, because Iran is very well prepared, because they have a huge force in Iran ready for this. And as they've said, a number of officials have said they're waiting for an invasion. But that's going to look extremely bad for Trump to lose on that scale, as well as, of course, they're covering up a lot of deaths. You imagine if they shoot down 6 manned aircraft, apart from the unmanned drones, they've been losing airmen, they've been losing people. When the Iranians destroyed the military bases in Bahrain and Kuwait and the UAE and so on, there are many, many US service people who've been killed there, but they've covered that up so far. It's going to come out down the track, or they'll die in accidents somewhere else or whatever. But to have more, an invasion force decimated by Iranian missiles and drones is really going to be a huge blow to Trump's image. So he's trying to avoid that, but he really wants some sort of trophy there and if he can't find one in Pakistan, I think the Iranians might have been impressed by the fact that he agreed to go in with Iran's 10 points as a basis for the negotiations, not his own points, but Iran's 10 points, which included getting the US out of the region, lifting all of the sanctions on Iran, stopping the war on Lebanon, which is something the Iranians are still committed to, but that depends on Trump being able to discipline, as the Iranians say, the rabid dog of Netanyahu attacking Iran. So there's a lot of uncertainties there. No one really knows which way it's going to go. Trump is looking for some off-ramp, as many people have said, basically. Can the Iranians find one for him? I'm not sure. The risk is, and the Iranians are ready for it, and this is why there's not a big appetite in Iran in public that I saw for a ceasefire. Many people were saying, keep going while we have the advantage, keep going. Don't let them rearm as they did after the 12-day war. So that's the strength that's behind the Iranian negotiating. They've got the strong unified population behind them. They've got control of Hormuz, which is not being taken away from them. They've got a very big arsenal still. They're still manufacturing more missiles in their underground factories. So they've got all that on their side, and Trump is really wants something. He wants something fairly quickly, but the Israelis are trying to sabotage it because they want Trump to stay in, basically. But I think other people have said, and I tend to agree, that I think Trump has been trying to please the Israelis and being, to some extent, manipulated by the Israelis. But I think in the end, his image is going to mean more to him. He doesn't want to sacrifice his whole image and his presidency so easily at the altar of Netanyahu. He's not that selfless a person, basically. So there is already a rift between the Israelis and the Trump regime, but whether he can pull a rabbit out of the hat in Pakistan remains to be seen.
I agree with you. And also, I think that it's important to note for our viewers and listeners that this is the midterm election season. We are headed to the midterms. This is a very big, basically, referendum on the Trump's first 2 years. And as you've seen, and everyone has seen, eight basic wars, for all intents and purposes, 8 countries, different countries bombed by the US. We've seen the illegal seizure, capture, abduction of President Maduro and his wife, not to mention the killing of 100 or so Venezuelans and Cubans in Venezuela. And so there's a lot that people are angry about. I think the MAGA coalition has fragmented. and you've seen him lash out against former allies like Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, even Alex Jones. So there's a lot to be said here. And I think that the next few days and weeks are really going to be pivotal for what happens not only with Iran in the region, but also in the United States domestically come November. So I think we'll definitely have you back on the show for sure. We had 3,000 live viewers. So I hope for those of you who don't know Dr. Tim Anderson, please follow him on social media. Read his books, buy them, read them. He's a very prolific and distinguished author. If you want to plug any of your media, please do, Dr. Anderson here.
No, just the latest book is on Yemen, which you may or may not have seen. Basically, I edited that one because it was mainly Yemeni authors, but also some non-Yemeni authors. Yemen is the big sleeper in this whole conflict, and I think people have understood it very poorly, you know. So that's the latest contribution with a lot of my colleagues. Basically, I'll have to send you a copy.
Yes, definitely. I got a digital copy from our mutual friend,
okay.
our mutual comrade. So I definitely have looked at a little bit of the book chapters, and very, very interesting, very comprehensive.
The Arabic translation has been done, so we'll have the Arabic version out soon too.
Excellent.
And the Greek and the Italian, I think, too.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you as always, Dr. Tim. It's always a pleasure. I hope to see you soon in person. We were together just a few months ago. Hope to see you again. Stay healthy, stay well, and look forward to having you on the show again soon.
Thanks very much, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you. Take care. So everyone, that was Dr. Tim Anderson. Please, if you're not following his media, please check it out. Follow him on X, on Instagram, wherever you can. Make sure to get his books and to read them. For those of you who don't know, today is Holy and Great Saturday in the Orthodox Church. So for those of our listeners from Russia, from Greece, and from other Orthodox countries, from Palestine, of course, from Lebanon, from Syria, Kali Anastasi, Kalo Pascha, and we won't be going live tonight. I'll be here with the different communities celebrating, and look forward to seeing you all very soon for our show tomorrow, our regular scheduled show tomorrow on DD Geopolitics. Take care, everyone. Have a wonderful day, and stay healthy and stay well.